There is a kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with tears at a graveside or a broken voice on a phone call at 2 in the morning. It comes quietly, in a conference room, on a Tuesday, while a family sits in their best clothes waiting to hear a dead man's final wishes. That is the kind of grief that changes people permanently, not because of what they lose, because of what they learn. On the morning of March 11th, 2026, David James drove to his family's attorney's office in Atlanta, Georgia. His father, Franklin James, had been dead for 11 days. 11 days since the funeral. 11 days since the repast, the condolence cards, the casseroles left on the porch. 11 days of grief that the James family wore the way Black families in the South have always worn it, with dignity, with composure, and with the unspoken agreement that you hold yourself together until you are alone. David sat down in that conference room believing the hardest part was behind him. He was wrong. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because what happened in that room in the next 11 minutes is the reason this family has not sat at the same table since. Franklin James was not a famous man. He was not the kind of man you would read about in a newspaper or see on a billboard. He was the kind of man you respected from a distance and admired up close. The deacon at the front of the church, the one other men called when they needed advice about money or business or how to carry themselves when the world was pressing down. He built a real estate portfolio in Southwest Atlanta over 3 decades that most men in his circle could only dream about. He raised 2 children who turned out right. He stayed married to the same woman for 44 years. By every measure that his community used to judge a man, Franklin James had lived an honorable life. And that is exactly what made what happened in that conference room so devastating. Because the people who fall the hardest are always the ones you never saw coming. There are 3 things you need to hold on to as this story unfolds. The first is a name, Walter Hayes. Franklin James had not spoken that name publicly in over 30 years. His children had heard it maybe twice in their entire lives. Always in passing, always vague, always followed by a subject change so smooth you almost didn't notice it happened. His wife Lorraine had not heard it spoken aloud in that house since the early 1990s. But Walter Hayes never left. He was always there, in the silence between what Franklin said and what he meant, in the business decisions that never fully made sense, in the version of their father that David and his sister Cheryl had been handed and told never to question. The second thing is a woman named Renee Hayes, an Atlanta attorney, a woman the James family had never met, never heard of, and had absolutely no reason to expect. She was sitting in the lobby of that law office on the morning of March 11th. She said Franklin had asked her to be there. She did not explain why. And the third thing, the one that holds all of this together, is 11 minutes of audio that Franklin James recorded on his phone sometime in the final weeks of his life and left instructions for his attorney to play for his family the morning his will was read. 11 minutes. That is all it took to dissolve something that had taken 4 decades to build. Franklin James was born in 1953 in a part of South Atlanta that the city's development boom largely forgot. His father worked sanitation. His mother cleaned houses in Buckhead 5 days a week and came home and cleaned her own. Franklin watched both of them pour themselves into work that the world did not respect. And he made a decision somewhere around the age of 14 that he was going to build something with his name on it. Not out of arrogance, out of love. He wanted to give his parents something to point to. He wanted his children to inherit more than struggle. That drive, quiet, disciplined, almost relentless, became the engine of everything the James family would eventually become. People who knew Franklin in those early years describe a man who was focused in a way that was almost unnerving. He didn't waste words. He didn't waste time. He was going somewhere, and he knew it. By his late 20s, Franklin had scraped together enough to go into business. He partnered with a man he had known since his early 20s, Walter Hayes, and together they launched a small construction and property management company in Southwest Atlanta. People who knew both men in that era say the partnership made sense immediately. Franklin was the strategist, the one who read contracts at midnight and showed up to city planning meetings that nobody else thought to attend. Walter was the relationship man, the one who could walk into a room full of strangers and leave with 3 new clients. They complemented each other completely. By the mid-1980s, their company was turning real profit. They were black men building real equity in Atlanta at a time when that still required fighting for every inch of ground. Within their circle, they were considered a success story. Brothers in business. Proof of what was possible. Lorraine James, née Lorraine Pruitt, had married Franklin in 1982. She was 24 years old, schoolteacher sharp, the daughter of a Baptist minister from Macon, Georgia. People who knew her then describe a woman who had a particular gift for holding a room together without ever raising her voice. She believed in Franklin completely, not blindly. She was too intelligent for blind faith, but with the full conviction of a woman who had studied her husband and made a clear-eyed decision. They built their home together in the West End neighborhood. David was born in 1979, before the marriage, and Cheryl came in 1982. Sunday dinners were non-negotiable. Church was non-negotiable. The idea that the James family was something worth protecting, that was the most non-negotiable thing of all. For 4 decades, Lorraine James held that belief like a stone in both hands. She would not let go of it until the morning a dead man's voice came through a phone speaker in a conference room and took it from her. In 1988, the city of Atlanta announced a redevelopment initiative targeting several blocks in the Southwest Corridor. 4 small black-owned construction and property management firms. It was the kind of opportunity that came once in a career, city contracts, federal backing, the kind of visibility that could transform a modest operation into something generational. Franklin James saw it immediately. Walter Hayes saw it too. Their company was positioned to compete, and both men knew it. What happened next would not become fully known to anyone outside of those 2 men for the next 36 years. But what the records show, and what Franklin's own voice would eventually confirm, is that sometime between late 1988 and the spring of 1989, Franklin James made a decision. A deliberate, calculated, quietly executed decision. And Walter Hayes never saw it coming from a man he considered his closest friend. Franklin restructured the company. He did it through a clause buried in their original operating agreement, language that Walter had signed but, by his own later admission, had not read with the attention it deserved. The clause allowed one partner to initiate a capital restructuring under specific conditions, and Franklin had spent months quietly engineering those conditions. By the time Walter Hayes sat down in their attorney's office in April of 1989, his ownership stake had been reduced from 50% to less than 8%. He had gone from equal partner to minority stakeholder in a company he had helped build with his own hands, his own relationships, and his own name. The deal that was supposed to make both of them was now going to make only one of them. And Franklin James had made sure of it legally, methodically, and in complete silence. The confrontation between the 2 men was private. No recordings exist. No legal proceedings followed, because Walter did not have the resources to mount a prolonged court battle against a man who had clearly planned this well enough to make it airtight. People who knew Walter during that period describe a man who went quiet in a way that was difficult to watch. He did not rage publicly. He did not go to the church and make a scene. He simply withdrew. He took his daughter Renee, who was 6 years old at the time, and he rebuilt his life in another part of Atlanta, slowly and without fanfare. He never spoke Franklin James's name in public again. And Franklin James, for his part, never acknowledged what he had done, not to his wife, not to his children, not to his congregation. He moved forward. The company grew. The family prospered. And Walter Hayes became nothing more than a name that made Lorraine James change the subject at dinner. What nobody in the James family knew, what David and Cheryl had never been told, and what Lorraine had spent decades managing carefully, was that the business betrayal was not the only thing Franklin James had buried. There was something else. Something older. Something that predated the restructuring, predated the contract dispute, predated even the version of Walter Hayes that the James children had been handed as a vague and distant footnote. Franklin had carried it longer than he had carried anything else in his life. And 3 weeks before he died, he picked up his phone and called Walter Hayes for the first time in 36 years. We do not know everything that was said in that phone call, but we know how it ended. Because Franklin James went home that night, sat down somewhere quiet, and pressed record. The office of Bernard Cole, family attorney, sat on the 4th floor of a building on Peachtree Road that Franklin James had helped renovate in 2009. David knew the building well. He had been inside it a dozen times over the years, signing documents, reviewing contracts, the ordinary business of a family that had accumulated enough to require professional management. Walking into it on March 11th felt like walking into a memory that hadn't finished happening yet. He rode the elevator in silence. Cheryl stood beside him. Lorraine was already inside when they arrived, seated at the far end of the conference table with her hands folded in her lap and her face arranged in the particular composure that David had watched his mother perform his entire life. The expression that said she was holding something and intended to keep holding it no matter what came next. The room smelled like coffee and wood polish. Bernard Cole greeted them quietly, and then his assistant appeared in the doorway and said there was a woman in the lobby. She said Franklin had asked her to be present. Her name was Renee Hayes. David would later say that the name meant nothing to him in that moment. It was just a name, 2 words spoken by a woman in a doorway in a building on Peachtree Road. But he noticed something else in that same moment that would not make sense to him until later. He noticed his mother's hands. Lorraine James, who had kept her hands folded perfectly still in her lap from the moment her children walked in, went rigid in a way that was almost imperceptible. Almost. David saw it. He did not know what he was seeing. He stepped into the lobby. Renee Hayes was standing near the window, composed, professional, dressed in the quiet way of a woman who had learned that her appearance was always the first thing a room would use to dismiss her. She told David she was an attorney. She told him she had known his father. She told him Franklin had specifically requested her presence at the reading. She offered no further explanation, and something in the way she held herself made David understand, instinctively, that pressing her would be a mistake. He brought her into the conference room. He watched his mother look at Renee Hayes for exactly 2 seconds and then look away. And Lorraine James did not look at her again for the rest of the morning. Bernard Cole moved through the early portions of the will with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times and understood that the kindest thing he could offer a grieving family was clarity and speed. Property holdings, business interests, personal accounts distributed between Lorraine, David, and Cheryl in portions that were fair and unsurprising. An endowment to their church. A scholarship fund Franklin had established quietly at a local high school that his children had not known existed. For about 20 minutes, it was the portrait of a man who had handled his affairs responsibly. A man who had thought about the people he was leaving behind and made sure they would be taken care of. And then Bernard Cole paused. He removed his glasses. He set down the document he had been reading from and reached for a folder that had been sitting separately at the edge of the table since before any of them arrived. He said that before the formal distribution was finalized, Franklin had left a recorded statement to be played for the family in full before the proceedings concluded. He said Franklin had been explicit about that instruction. The recording was to be played. All of them were to hear it, and it was to be played before anyone left the room. David said later that the silence between Bernard finishing that sentence and pressing play lasted about 4 seconds. He said it felt like 4 hours. He said he looked at Cheryl, and Cheryl looked back at him with the expression she always wore when she was frightened, but did not want to be the first one to say so. He said he looked at his mother, and Lorraine was looking at the table. He said he looked at Renee Hayes, and Renee Hayes was looking at her own hands. And then Bernard Cole pressed play. Franklin James's voice filled the room. Tired, deliberate, close to the end, but clear. Clear enough that David said he could hear his father's breathing between sentences. Clear enough that Cheryl said afterward she kept expecting him to stop and say he was just checking that the recording worked. He did not stop. He spoke for 11 minutes and 14 seconds. He began with Walter Hayes. He described what he had done in 1989 in precise detail. The way a man describes something he has rehearsed 10,000 times in his own mind and finally decided to say out loud. He named the clause in the operating agreement. He described the months of preparation. He said Walter Hayes had been his closest friend and his most trusted partner, and that he had stolen from him. Not at gunpoint, not in anger, but with paperwork and patience, which he said was a worse kind of theft because it required him to look Walter in the eye every single day while he was doing it. He said he had told himself for decades that the business justified the method, that he had worked harder, that he had seen the opportunity more clearly, that Walter would have been satisfied with his portion. He said all of those things, and then he said he knew, and had always known, that none of them were true. He said Walter Hayes deserved better than what he got. He said he was sorry, and then he said the other thing. The thing that changed the molecular composition of every relationship in that room. He said that in 1986, 3 years before the business restructuring, when the partnership was still whole and both families were still close, he had been involved, briefly, with Walter's wife. He said it lasted less than a year. He said Walter's wife had passed away in 2011 and could not speak for herself, and he wanted the record to reflect that she had ended it and that what happened was his fault entirely. And then he said that Renee Hayes, the woman sitting in the chair at the far end of that conference room, was his biological daughter. There is a particular kind of silence that descends on a room when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. It is not the silence of shock alone, though shock is part of it. It is the silence of recalibration, of every person present quietly and rapidly dismantling the version of reality they walked in with and trying to construct something new from the wreckage. That is the silence that fell over the fourth floor of that building on Peachtree Road on the morning of March 11, 2026. Bernard Cole did not speak. He set the device down on the table and folded his hands and looked at nothing in particular, the way professionals learn to do when they are in the presence of something they cannot fix. Cheryl James Powell would later say that her first coherent thought, after her father's voice stopped, was that she could hear the air conditioning. She had never noticed the air conditioning in that building before. She noticed it then because everything else had gone completely still. David James stood up first. Not dramatically. He did not overturn a chair or raise his voice. He simply stood, the way a man stands when he needs to feel the floor under his feet to confirm that something solid still exists, and he walked into the hallway and stood there alone for a moment. Cheryl went to her mother. Lorraine James had not moved. She was still looking at the table, still holding the composure she had carried into that room like a piece of armor she had been wearing so long she had forgotten it was there. Cheryl sat beside her and took her hand. Lorraine allowed it. She did not cry. She did not speak. She sat in the particular stillness of a woman who had just heard a recording confirm something she had spent 36 years convincing herself she did not know. Because that is the thing about Lorraine James that the family would only begin to understand in the weeks that followed. She had known. Not all of it. Not the specific shape of it. But she had known in the way that a woman who has spent 4 decades studying one man knows when something in him does not add up. She had found a letter once, in the early 1990s, half-written and never sent, tucked inside a book on Franklin's desk. She had read enough to understand what it was. She had folded it back up, replaced it exactly where she found it, and never mentioned it. She had made a choice. She had chosen the family. She had chosen the name and the house and the Sunday dinners and the man at the head of the table, and she had made that choice with full awareness that she was choosing it over the truth. David came back into the room, and he looked at his mother, and he asked her one question. He asked her if she had known. Lorraine James raised her eyes from the table and met her son's gaze. She did not answer immediately. The pause was long enough to be its own answer. When she did speak, she said she had suspected. She said she had never confirmed it. She said she had made a decision to keep the family together, and she would make the same decision again. David looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked away. He did not raise his voice. He did not say anything cruel. What he said was quiet and precise, and in some ways harder to hear than anger would have been. He told her that he was not angry about what his father had done. He said he understood, on some level, that his father was a flawed man who had made catastrophic choices and had ultimately found a form of courage too late to matter. What he told Lorraine was that he was angry about the performance. About the 46 years of Sunday dinners and church pews and life lessons delivered by a man his mother knew was not entirely who he claimed to be. He said the grief he felt standing in that hallway alone was not just grief for his father. It was grief for the version of his father he had been handed, carefully, consistently, protectively, and had built his entire sense of himself around. He said losing a parent was survivable. Losing the story of that parent was something different entirely. Lorraine James did not respond. She looked at her son with an expression David would describe later as the saddest thing he had ever seen on a human face. Not guilt, not defiance, just the exhausted recognition of a woman who had known this conversation was coming for 36 years and had never once figured out what she was going to say when it arrived. Across the room, something different was happening. Cheryl James Powell had excused herself from her mother's side and crossed to where Renee Hayes was sitting. Renee had not spoken since the recording ended. She had remained in her chair with the stillness of someone who had already processed the most difficult version of this moment many times in private and had arrived that morning prepared for whatever shape it took. Cheryl sat down across from her. She looked at Renee Hayes the way you look at something that simultaneously breaks your heart and fills it, studying the structure of her face, the set of her jaw, the particular way she held her shoulders back. Later, Cheryl would tell a close friend that it was like looking at a photograph of her father taken from an angle she had never seen before. She said she could see him in Renee's face so clearly that it knocked the air out of her. She said she did not know whether to apologize or introduce herself or simply sit there and let the fact of it be real. What she did was reach across the table and take Renee Hayes' hand. She held it without speaking for almost a full minute. And then she said, quietly, that she was sorry Renee had grown up without knowing who her father was. Renee looked at her and said she had known for 3 years, that a DNA ancestry test had surfaced the connection in early 2023, and that Franklin had called her 6 weeks after she sent him a letter. She said they had spoken several times before his health declined significantly. She said he had been trying, in his way, to make it right. Cheryl asked her whether he had. Renee Hayes considered the question carefully. She said she did not know yet. That same afternoon, David James drove across Atlanta to a neighborhood in Decatur where Walter Hayes had lived for the past 19 years. He rang the doorbell, not knowing what he would say, or what he had any right to say, or whether Walter Hayes would open the door at all. Walter opened it within seconds, as though he had been expecting someone, though not necessarily David specifically. He was 71 years old, and he looked like a man who had survived something difficult and come out the other side of it with his dignity fully intact. He looked at David James standing on his porch, Franklin's son, built like his father, with his father's posture and something of his father's eyes, and he did not look surprised or hostile or particularly emotional. He said simply, "I wondered when one of you would come." He stepped back from the doorway. David walked in. Walter made coffee. They sat at a kitchen table for almost 2 hours. Walter did not perform bitterness, and he did not perform forgiveness. He spoke about what Franklin had done with the specificity of a man who had turned it over in his mind for decades and arrived at a place of clear-eyed understanding without arriving at peace about it. He said he had rebuilt. He said Renee had become an attorney, and he was proud of her in a way that eclipsed everything else. He said he had stopped measuring his life by what Franklin James had taken from him sometime around his mid-50s because the accounting was making him smaller, and he refused to be made smaller. But he also said something else. He said that forgiveness and debt are not the same thing. He said he had forgiven Franklin James for his own preservation. He said that did not mean the debt had been cleared. David sat with that for a long time. He drove home in silence. He did not call his mother that night. There is a question that sat at the center of everything the James family went through in the weeks following that morning on Peachtree Road, and it is a question that does not have a clean answer. It is the question of what Franklin James believed he was doing when he made that recording. Because the easy interpretation, the one that requires the least from us, is that he was a dying man seeking absolution, that he had carried the weight of what he did to Walter Hayes and what he did to Lorraine for 4 decades, and that in his final weeks, with the body failing and the end no longer abstract, he simply could not leave without putting it down. That is one way to read it. But David James, who is not a man given to easy interpretations, sat with that reading for several weeks and ultimately rejected it. He said that a man seeking absolution picks up the phone. He calls his son. He asks his daughter to sit with him. He looks his wife in the eye in the privacy of their bedroom, and he tells her what she already suspects, and he asks her to forgive him while there is still time to be forgiven in person. What his father did instead was engineer a situation in which the truth would land in a room he would never have to sit in, among people who would have no ability to respond to him, delivered in a format that gave him complete control over every word. David said that was not courage dressed up as confession. He said that was control dressed up as courage. And he said it was the most his father thing his father had ever done. 6 weeks after the will reading, the shape of what the James family had become was still being negotiated in real time. David had spoken to Lorraine twice, brief, functional conversations about estate logistics that neither of them extended beyond what the business required. Cheryl spoke to her mother daily, as she always had, but she described those conversations to a close friend as feeling like talking to someone through glass, familiar and present, and somehow completely unreachable. The relationship between David and Cheryl, which had always been close in the uncomplicated way of siblings who grew up in the same house with the same values, was now navigating a fault line neither of them had anticipated. They did not disagree about what their father had done. They disagreed about what their mother deserved. Cheryl believed Lorraine had made an impossible choice under impossible circumstances and that condemning her for it was a failure of empathy. David believed that his mother's choice, however understandable in isolation, had made him complicit in a lie he had never consented to, that every version of his father he had been handed, every lesson, every standard, every measure of manhood he had inherited from that house, had been curated by a woman who knew the curator was compromised. He said he needed time. He was still needing it. Renee Hayes attended the repast that Lorraine held at the family home 3 days after the will reading, a small, quiet gathering for close family and church members that Lorraine had insisted on hosting because Franklin would have wanted it that way. Renee came alone. She did not stay long. She moved through the rooms of a house that was half familiar to her in the way that inherited things sometimes are, objects and photographs, and a particular quality of light that she recognized not from memory, but from resemblance. She spent several minutes looking at a photograph of Franklin James on the mantel, taken sometime in the late 1990s, when he was in his mid-40s, at what appeared to be a company event. She had a photograph of herself taken around the same age. She had looked at both of them side by side on her phone the night before the will reading and had not known what to feel. At the repast, Lorraine James spoke to Renee Hayes for the first and, so far, only time. It lasted less than 4 minutes. Nobody who was present has shared what was said. What people did notice was that when Renee left, Lorraine stood at the window and watched her walk to her car. She stood there for a long time after the car had gone. The estate itself was settled without legal dispute. Renee Hayes had been included, a portion modest enough to suggest Franklin understood he had no right to make a grand gesture, significant enough to suggest he understood he owed her something. She did not keep it. Within 30 days of receiving it, she directed the full amount to a Black entrepreneurship fund in Atlanta, designated specifically for first-generation business owners in the Southwest Corridor, the same part of the city where Franklin James and Walter Hayes had started with nothing. She made the donation in Walter Hayes's name. She did not issue a statement. She did not notify the James family. They found out the way most people find out about quiet acts of integrity, through someone who happened to know someone who happened to see the paperwork. David, when he heard about it, sat with it for a long time before he said anything. What he eventually said to Cheryl was that Renee Hayes was the most dignified person in the entire story. Cheryl told him she had thought the same thing since the moment Renee took her hand in that conference room. As of today, David James has not returned to the family home. He has not cut contact with Lorraine. He is too much his mother's son for that. And somewhere beneath the anger is the full understanding that she is a 70-year-old woman who just buried her husband and is now navigating the collapse of the version of that husband she had publicly maintained for most of her adult life. But he has not sat at her table. He has not been back to the church where the pew his father occupied for 31 years is still empty. Nobody has sat in it. Whether by intention or by the unspoken consensus of a congregation that understood something had shifted, the space has remained. Walter Hayes, when David told him about the pew during one of their subsequent conversations, and there have been subsequent conversations, quiet ones, more frequent than anyone expected, said that sounded about right. He said some spaces needed to stay empty for a while before anybody figured out what to do with them. David said he thought that was true of more than just the pew. What this story ultimately asks of the people who move through it, and what it asks of anyone watching from the outside, is something that does not resolve neatly. Franklin James built something real. 3 decades of disciplined work, genuine faith, and real love for his children produced something that mattered and will continue to matter regardless of what that recording revealed. The scholarship fund at the high school still carries his name. The properties he developed still house families. The business David runs still employs people whose mortgages depend on it. None of that disappears. But none of it is uncomplicated anymore either. Because the foundation it was built on had a fracture running through it from the very beginning. A fracture Franklin had spent 40 years painting over with the consistency of his presence, the authority of his reputation, and the love, which was genuine, that he gave his family every day while withholding the one thing that would have made it whole. He was a man who was capable of extraordinary loyalty and extraordinary betrayal, sometimes toward the same person, sometimes in the same decade. He was, in other words, fully human. The question the James family is still sitting with, and the question that will take years, not months, to answer, is whether fully human is enough. There is one more thing. In the weeks after the will reading, David found himself returning repeatedly to something Walter Hayes had said during that first conversation at the kitchen table in Decatur. Walter had said that Franklin called him 3 weeks before he died. David asked what they had talked about. Walter was quiet for a moment. He said Franklin had not called to explain. He had not called to negotiate or justify or ask for anything. He said Franklin had called to tell him that building that company with him had been the best professional experience of his life. He said Franklin had called to tell him that he had missed his friendship every day for 36 years. He said Franklin had told him he was proud of what Walter had built after everything, and that he had followed it from a distance for decades. And then Walter paused. He looked at his coffee. He said Franklin had cried on the phone. He said he had not heard Franklin James cry since they were young men, and something about hearing it, even now, even after everything, had hit him somewhere he had not expected. David asked Walter what he had said in response. Walter Hayes picked up his coffee cup and looked out the window at his backyard for a long moment before he answered. He said he had told Franklin that he accepted the call. He said he had told him that was all he was prepared to give him, and that Franklin had said that was more than he deserved. And then Walter looked back at David and said something that David has repeated to Cheryl twice since, and that neither of them has been able to fully put down. He said, "Your father was a great man who did a terrible thing. Most of the great men I've known were exactly that. The ones who aren't willing to say so, those are the ones you really have to watch out for." Franklin James pressed record on that phone knowing he would never have to watch what happened next. He would not see his son standing alone in a hallway trying to rebuild the architecture of a man he had spent 46 years looking up to. He would not see his daughter holding a stranger's hand across a conference table because the stranger had his nose and his eyes and had spent her entire life without his name. He would not see his wife standing at a window long after a car had disappeared down a street, holding 36 years of a secret that had finally, irreversibly, become someone else's to carry. He got to say what he needed to say, and then he got to be gone. And whether that was the act of a man who had finally found his courage or the final maneuver of a man who had spent his whole life controlling the room, that is not a question I can answer for you. That is the question I want you to sit with. Because here is what I know. Every family has a Franklin James. Not necessarily a man who did exactly what he did. Not necessarily someone who restructured a partnership or kept a secret for 4 decades or left a recorded confession for a room full of people he would never face. But every family has someone who held something. Someone who made a choice, long ago, to protect the image of the thing rather than the foundation of it. Someone who painted over the fracture because the painting was easier than the repair, and because they were good enough at it, and because the people around them needed to believe the wall was solid. Most of those secrets stay buried. Most of them go to the grave exactly as intended, and the families built on top of them never find out and live their lives and love each other and are fine. But some of them don't. Some of them come back. Some of them come back on a Tuesday morning in a conference room on Peachtree Road in the voice of a man who has been dead for 11 days and still has more to say than anyone was prepared to hear. So I want to ask you something directly, and I want you to answer it in the comments because I read them, and this community thinks in ways that genuinely surprise me. Was what Franklin James did on that recording an act of courage or an act of cowardice? Because I have turned that question over more times than I can count working on this story, and I keep landing in a different place depending on the day. Some days I think he did the only honest thing he had ever truly done, and that it cost him nothing because he was already gone. And that is a particular kind of bravery, even if it is an imperfect one. Other days I think David James is exactly right, that a man with genuine courage picks up the phone while he is still alive and sits with the consequences in real time. I want to know where you land. And I want to know something else. I want to know if this story reminded you of anyone. Not a famous person. Not a case you read about. Someone closer than that. You do not have to say who. You just have to tell me if you recognize something in this family that you have seen before. Because I think you did. I think that is exactly why you are still here. If this story moved you, if it made you think about legacy and truth and the difference between a life that looks right and a life that is right, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Not for an algorithm. Not for a number. Because the stories we bring here are built to do what this one did, to take something real and sit inside it long enough to find what it actually means. And the next story is already waiting. A woman who spent 22 years believing she was her mother's favorite. Then she got access to her mother's email. One folder, and everything she thought she knew about where she came from and who loved her and why she had always felt like she was standing slightly outside her own family. All of it shifted in the time it takes to read an inbox. That story is coming. Make sure you are here when it does. Because some doors, once you open them, you cannot close. And the people on the other side of this one were not ready either.